Well, it's my pleasure this week to welcome you all back to our conversation that follows up on last week's presentation on communities making a difference. And one of the things I noticed as I was putting things together for this week was there is this piece in our title, communities. And communities, although most of us who are on this call are probably community of Christ and working within our congregations or jurisdictions, if you don't fall under that particular category, you are still welcome. And even those of us who are part of community of Christ, it may be a community other than the church to which you are called to make a difference. And our spiritual practice is about expanding our sense of community. And so we're going to work a little bit with community, and we're going to spend most of our time on exploring further the possibilities for making a difference. But I want to first start with just reminding you of our upcoming climate justice events. We are going to host a prayer vigil on New Year's Eve, going into early New Year's Day. We don't have the details worked out yet, but we promise we will be getting back to you. Susan spent time yesterday with Randy Litzenberger, who's going to be our guest in January, for a very special review of the COP26 Glasgow meeting that took place in early November. So really want you to get that on the calendar. And like you to also make note of a date change for January 23rd for the follow-up conversation. It turns out that January 16th is Racial Justice Sunday, and we want everyone to be free to be participating in events that are going on around racial justice. Also, if your congregation is addressing climate change and you have a video to contribute with some ideas or your own stories, please send them to Rod. Wanted to say just really quickly, these are topics under consideration for the January 9th webinar. Try to whet your appetite. Make sure you not only put it on your calendar, but get it on the calendar of some friends. Susan and Randy are talking about the disappointments as well as signs of progress that came out of the climate summit. They'll be talking about developments in clean energy, about hearing voices that came from outside the mainstream, plausible scenarios for dramatic changes that might be for the good in the next 10 years, and shocking directions towards hope and decreased carbon emissions. So stay tuned. I would like to start us off with a story. And the story I want to start you off hearing is written by Steve Chase in his book, Nature as Spiritual Practice. Steve was actually one of my thesis advisors. So I have a smile on my face as I read this story. But inviting us now as we to move into this spiritual practice space, move back into that place of listening. A friend, Steve writes, once showed me an old cottonwood, its trunk hollowed with age, but still standing, still putting out leaves each spring and letting them go each fall. Stand inside, my friend whispered. I felt good standing in the hollow. I felt comforted. Looking up, I could see open sky. And then the wind blew in from the north, quite sharp, and I could hear a deep tone as if the cottonwood were the reed of a wind instrument, deepening a quarter, a fifth, as the wind shifted. Embraced in the old cottonwood, I stood for some time. And then walking home, I said to my friend, it's almost like the wind in the tree were talking to me. Almost, she said. We walked on a bit, and then she asked, and what did the sky say? So let me remind you, for those of you who were with us last week and who received this assignment, what we did last week was took this same intuition as Alexio Divina from Job, who recognized that the wisdom of the natural world trumps sometimes the wisdom of well-meaning friends who don't know what they're talking about. And he said, ask the animals and they will teach you. The birds in the sky, the plants of the earth, the fish of the sea. And so you were invited to spend time wandering this week in a place that called to you. You were invited to ask the land and the beings who live there what they desire, to wander through that space that called you with an open heart and asking of the sacred presence there, the trees and the stones and the squirrels, asking them what is needed here and how can we be of service to the land. Now, my guess is that not everybody had time to do that this week, but many of us have had this kind of an experience. If you had that chance this week to really ask how you could be of service, that's wonderful. But whether it was this week or a month ago or a year ago or last time you were at reunion, just in the chat, share. I invite your sharing. What is the place that drew you? What is the place that is calling you to spend time seeking to serve the land? I'm actually not seeing the chat. There we go. Just a few minutes. My neighborhood out in the country, a pond behind my home. The birds are always everywhere. Did anyone go maybe to their congregation space or a reunion ground? My garden, I have blooming things even now. Watching the sunrise over the eastern mountain range. Boglewood. And I'll broaden the question, who or what non-human other might you have encountered? The agricultural area in British Columbia that's flooded. Just inviting you to read your chat. The green alley between houses in my neighborhood, overgrown and wild. Went to Samish with the eagles circling over the sanctuary as if there was a thermal rising from what was occurring inside. Were they listening? The grove behind my neighborhood and me. I think I missed a few, but I hope you're all seeing them. So here's a question I want to spend some time on, and I'll get out of share so that we can see each other, I think. What, as you have begun a relationship with another creature, was there anything that you heard? Is there anything anybody would like to speak to real briefly what they heard? You can just pop right on in. Or just if you want to say a little bit about your walk, your encounter, your learning to speak tree or sky. To listen to the garden, to listen to the flooded plains. Claudia, take yourself off mute. You're on mute. Oh,
Or you're not muted because I gave everybody the option to unmute themselves.
Oh, thank you. Okay. A sign came up and said, the host is not allowing participants. So, and maybe that's why it was so quiet for a while, but I do want to share that we have a camellia that blooms October, November, December, January. And the honeybees are in it, and a really small hummingbird. And also we have a hot lips, a stilby, I think it's called. And it's right outside our kitchen window, and the hummingbirds come to it so often. And one day a hummingbird came up to the window and almost, it just was like, looked at me and said, thank you. I mean, I know it didn't, but it was, I did feel that they're very happy with those things. So that's, and I'm thankful for them. Thank you.
Chloe, I've had the exact same experience with hummingbirds, and I love the birds early in the morning. It's almost as if they're saying hello, and they're so excited to see the sunrise. I just thoroughly enjoy the birds.
Lovely. Gary.
My wife and I live on the side of a mountain in Abbotsford. If I go down the hill, I'm under 6 feet of water. The whole valley is flooded. But I go up the hill every morning on my walk, and I walk through the park. And it's an unbelievable little, away from everything. And I'm walking through piles and piles of maple leaves, some of them 15, 16 inches wide. And that's quite an amazing thing to see and to be in. And just the contrast between the two is quite striking for me every day.
Yeah. Anyone else? And please put things in chat as well. So, and we'll save it and try to get some things out. Susan.
Yes, I spoke to some silver dollar plants that were old and looked very fragile, and as if they would crumble if I even touched them. There was a breeze blowing, and here they were flickering and moving in the wind and never letting go. And they spoke back to me of fragility and the steadfastness and the hanging on, even when we are old and decrepit and look like we could crumble in a moment. They hung on, and they spoke powerfully to me about that.
Thank you, Susan. One more. Anyone else? Tom.
On the beach in Hawaii where we swim sometimes, not every day, we will see a bird standing on some rocks out in the water. And I believe it's called a night heron. It's about 2.5 feet tall.
Mm-hmm.
I call it a fisher bird. Only one time have I seen it catch a fish. But what amazes me about that bird is it stands on that rock. At times you have to stare at it and say, is that really a living thing? Because it's so still. Mm-hmm. It will move every now and then, but it's got incredible patience, and it just stands and it waits. And sometimes I've watched that bird for 20 minutes. And most of the time I never see it catch a fish. One time I've seen that bird catch a fish, and it's rapid. It can grab the fish so quickly, and you can see the fish going down its throat. But it amazes me, the patience, and it knows, this bird knows it's being provided for. It just has to fulfill what it knows and go to the water and be patient. Yeah. And wait and wait. And sustenance will come.
An icon of patience and waiting for sustenance. Sarah.
I appreciate being out in nature when we go on our walks, and we'll walk by a wetlands area, and I'm not quite sure the animal, whether it's a toad or frog, but the choir that they are. I'm an artist, and so I'm visual, but I appreciate when I hear the animals, and they're the choir that they are that are just so loud. It also reminds me of being a child in the middle of Kansas, where the cicadas or the locusts were, and they were just so loud every single day that you just kind of tuned them out, because they were just that was just the song that you heard every day. So I
Mhm.
appreciate the sounds that nature bring.
The sounds of nature and conversation.
Mhm.
A conversation to which we're invited. I'm going to let Joan in, but what I want to invite us to do is really watch your heart as we share these stories of how we love the earth. Joan.
I just spent time in my backyard this week with the trees and the bushes and the rocks. And I kept getting this sense that it's almost like a question. Are you paying attention? Why aren't you paying attention? Because so often when I'm out there, I'm, just absorbed in my own thoughts and my own agendas. And I was getting this sense of how the trees and the bushes and the birds and the squirrels, it's all just in the moment and celebrating the moment, but loving it fully and completely. And the interconnect in an interconnected way that, they're all sensing each other. And we're just kind of, I'm feeling like I'm behind glass because I'm not normally part of this connection. I've tuned out.
And yet we are fundamentally part of this larger community. And in our congregations and places where we want to make a difference, there is a larger community to which we belong. So I almost want to do a show of hands. Do you have the sense, just really quickly, that loving the earth empowers you to make a difference? I'll say this. So here's the second question. I'm going to go back to the share screen because I just want to give, I'm going to keep coming back to this. Here's the question I want you to take away today and go back into nature. Does the earth love you back? We don't have time to go around and kind of talk about it, but does the earth love you back? Robin Wall Kimmerer wrote this, with my favorite book. It's the first one I would replace if my library went south. She's a Native American botanist who listens to plants and learns from plants. So she takes seriously that one verse of Job, even though that's not her home place. But she tells this story about asking this set of questions. Do you love the earth? And everybody to a graduate writing workshop on relationship to the land, nature lovers, all of them raise their hand. First question, easy. And then she says, when she asked the second question, does the earth love you back? There was dead silence because it surprises us. We don't tend to think about the ways in which the earth is loving us back. And she argues that when the relationship between you and the earth is mutual, a two-way street, when the love between you and a particular creature who inhabits and shares the space of land where you are is reciprocal, that's when the magic happens. That sacred bond that's created transforms our relationships. And that it is when we enter into a relationship, not as a one-way street, me loving the earth, but as a two-way street, the earth loving me back, we enter into a sacred bond that really and truly empowers us. And I'm just beginning to explore this. I have this intuition. I want to write this article about reimagining stewardship as reciprocity. This is the word that she uses. And many writers, nature writers, are now starting to pick up on and use this word. And so I just send you off into the week, considering how community wants to be expanded, I send you off into the month because we're coming back together possibly for a prayer vigil. And whether we talk about that specifically or not, I invite you into simply this exploration. You're right at we're all at the very beginning of what it is to be in a reciprocal relationship with the earth, a relationship that bonds us in love and that will bring us to act and to really, really want to make a difference in the world. And so that's our spiritual practice for today. And we are going to now go on with working on the second part of our title, which is making a difference. And thank you for all your input. I would love to hear more, so type it in the chat.
Thanks, Laurie. Oh, somehow my picture messed up. Okay, there. So last week in our webinar, we introduced a process that might be helpful to you in thinking about how to get started on climate action as a community, whether that's a congregation or any other type of community. To try to make it seem less daunting and break it down into pieces. That's not what we're going to focus on tonight. Tonight, we want to focus on topics. I want you to think back to what are the topics that interested you or intrigued you the most, that excited you or captured your imagination. We've kind of broken what we saw out of the interviews, both the clips that were presented in the webinar and also the full interviews. And so we identified some topics. We identified about 6 topics. And in a few minutes, we're going to give you an opportunity to discuss that. But first of all, we want to go over those with you. So if we could have the next slide, please, Rod. The first one, and I'm going to spend a little time on that here, is how to get started, who to involve. I'm going to list the other topics in a minute, but while you're thinking about the topics, we'll be happy to have your questions in the chat. And I know I'm not explaining this coherently. Apologize for that. But we wanted to bring this one in particular out for just a minute here, how to get started, who to involve, because we noticed something in the interview clips. In some congregations, it's a very top-down approach. Somebody took a motion to a mission-centered conference or a business meeting and sought to get consensus from the congregation. In other cases, it was a grassroots approach, coming from the ground up, 1 or 2 people, like with Aaron Richards and the Orange, California congregation, 1 or 2 families were passionate about it and people supported them. In other cases, it was, somebody floating an idea and getting a team or a discussion group. So we just wanted to point that out. And we're going to point out another few things that we didn't quite get covered well in the webinar. And so we wanted to start talking about here the food forest that Kitchener put in. And the reason we wanted to do it primarily is because we think some of you may be interested in this, even if you're not interested in the whole topic. But we wanted to introduce this lasagna gardening technique because we've had some questions about it. We also had some questions about putting in more pictures. So we're going to give you some pictures and also talk to you about the lasagna technique. So the food forest, I know this is a terrible copy. You can't read it, but this is what the plan looks like. You take a whole bunch of plants that are edible to humans or to the small animals that you might have around, or that are pollinator plants, or a combination, and you cram them into a small space so that it really does look like a forest when you're done. And that cuts down on the weeding, and you still get, bountiful harvest the next year, not the first year. So this lasagna planting technique is really regenerative, regenerates the soil. And so if we go to the next slide, I'll show you the beginning of what the process looked like for our congregation. Like many congregations, we just had lawn. There's hardly any topsoil. It's in terrible shape. It's as hard as concrete. Nothing much lives in it. And so this is the very beginning of this lasagna process. You just simply dig some holes for where you want the plants to go. They don't have to be all that deep because you're going to build the soil up. Next slide. And then the next process is wetting cardboard. You really soak the cardboard and tear it into strips and pieces and put it on the ground all around the plants. This actually keeps the moisture in. The cardboard breaks down and helps feed the soil, and it keeps the weeds and the grass from growing up. So the next slide shows us starting to put the cardboard down, and then once we get that down, putting some compost or topsoil, just a thin layer to hold the cardboard in place. Next slide. Once you do that, you put down straw or twigs. It adds, again, nutrients. It adds space and air for organisms to grow and to flourish, and some cushioning helps to make the ground a little more spongy. Next slide. When you're done that, you add more compost or topsoil and finish off with mulch. And our last slide is of what it looked like after we were finished and watering it all in. And our plan is we just started with this small area to get experience. The most challenging part of it was digging the holes. So what we plan to do next year is expand the area without planting anything. We'll just expand the lasagna method, let it all soak in for a year, and then when the ground's more porous, we'll plant things, and it won't be nearly so backbreaking. So I hope you're interested in that method. It's can work anywhere in your yards, in your congregations, anywhere, for drastically increasing the porosity, the biodiversity, the health of your soil, allowing it to absorb more rainwater, and providing food for a diverse number of species. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lori, I think.
Yep, that's coming up next. So another question that we receive and that comes to us not just last week, but all the time, is this question about, I want to do this work in my community, but I don't know how to speak about and act on climate change in my congregation, because there are people that I actually love and respect who deny climate change or even actively resist or thwart efforts to make this a priority. So we plan, hopefully for next year, we're working on trying to find some speakers to speak to cognitive biases and ways that we can talk about climate change. But I wanted to whet your appetite with about a 3-minute excerpt from an On Being podcast that was given by Katharine Hayhoe just less than a month ago, or no, a month ago today. And Katharine Hayhoe is the chief scientist for Nature Conservancy. Those of you who are familiar with that environmental program, she's an atmospheric scientist. She's done very complex statistical analyses about local effects of climate change, so that if you want to know how it's going to affect your city, her statistical work helps you do that. So she is a very dedicated and very excellent scientist. And she's also a Christian. Her husband is an evangelical pastor. They live in Texas, where there's a lot of resistance to these ideas. And she spends a lot of time talking with Christian groups about what it is to care for the planet, why it matters to her, and solutions. So I'm going to go through her, just let you listen to this 3-minute clip. She speaks a little quickly, so I've put everything into also so that you can read the most salient points that she offers. So here we go. You know what? I'm going to make sure I got my sound on here correctly before I even start. I do. All right. Here we go.
So often we see caring about climate change and acting on climate to be either unrelated to who we are, or even often, sadly, as Christians living in the US, antithetical to who we are.
Yeah.
But the reality is that whoever we are, whatever is at the top of our priority list, whether it is the safety and welfare of our family, whether it is a faith that we adhere to, whether it is the job that we do or something, an activity that we're passionate about, whatever we care about, climate change is already, not in the future. Now, it is already affecting everything that's already at the top of our list. So caring about this issue and acting on it is not only consistent with who we are, but it enables us to more genuinely express what we truly care about. Our family, our faith, the place where we live, the work that we do, the activity that we enjoy, that we're passionate about. And so it's not about changing who we are. It's not about telling people that they don't have the right values, they're not the right person, or they don't care for the right reasons. It's about acknowledging that to care about climate change, you only have to be one thing, and that one thing is a human living on planet Earth. And if someone does not think that they care about this issue and does not support climate action, it is simply because they have not connected the dots between what they care about and how climate change is affecting it. And they don't know what real climate solutions look like, because when they find out what those look like, there is overwhelming support across the US, even in some of the reddest parts of the country, when people say, oh, you want to do that? Well, that sounds great.
So let me just pause here. Elsewhere in this podcast, Hayhoe actually emphasizes that the solutions, the things that we want to do to make a difference, aren't what the problem is. She says, same thing, I just want to reiterate this. When we actually start talking about real solutions, when we ask people whether they agree with real solutions, everybody's on board, or almost everybody, she says. There's a small percentage who aren't, but almost everybody says, heck yes, I'd love to do that. And that, she says, is how we directly address the fear that is simply a fear of the loss of identity, that when we just try to be proselytizers on climate change, we end up just creating chaos. Her final advice is about how to talk about climate change. So here we go.
Don't talk about the science in Antarctica and global temperatures. Talk about
She
how it's
says,
affecting.
as one of the leading atmospheric scientists.
Right,
yes.
right. I'm a scientist. I'm saying don't talk about the science. I'm saying, if you really love science, sure, talk about it. But talk about why it matters to you. Talk about how you both, ski, or you're both parents and you're worried about your kids in the playground being too hot for them, or the fact that you fish and you've noticed that the fish populations are changing, or the fact that your basement got flooded last time it rained. Talk about something that matters to you and to the person that you're talking with, and then do your research to learn about what real climate solutions look like and share that information with people.
So we don't want to make that, we don't want to oversimplify it or romanticize. This can be a problem for us when we have communities that want to make a difference. But I think this is a great place to start. We will be coming back. Here's what she says, talk about it. But don't argue the facts of climate change, especially, you know, if it's just a way of trying to convince somebody, because trying to convince somebody won't work. Just talk about why it matters to you and to the person you're talking about. Be in a relationship. It's as simple as that. And then research, do your work. That's what we're trying to do here on real climate solutions. And often this response comes, you want to do that? Well, that sounds great. She also says, just ask, know what your city's doing. Find out what your city's doing. Know what your state's doing. Do you know what your church is doing? And if you don't know, ask. And if they're not doing anything, hey, there are some things that you could be doing. And she does on her website have a list of things that churches can do, a list of things that schools can do. And so for more information, you can go to catherinehayhoe.com, and under the frequently asked questions, one of them is, how can I have a positive, constructive conversation about climate change? So if this is a problem for you, just wanted to offer this resource. She has a TED Talk. There are links to that under this question. And for those of you who are a little bit more irreverent, she actually just recently did an interview with Jimmy Kimmel, which is pretty hysterical, although not politically correct. So, but you can look that up if you're interested in hearing about it through the lens of Jimmy Kimmel. So, Rod, another question.
May I ask a question? May I ask a question?
Real quickly, yeah.
Where does she live in Texas?
She lives in Lubbock.
Thank you.
And she does do a lot of speaking in different churches around there. And I would recommend the entire podcast, actually. There's a lot more information in the podcast about her background.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Rod. I suspect you're muted, Rod.
Yes, and I also had to adjust some screens. So thank you all for your patience. One of the other resources we are making available for you, it's not up on the website right at the moment, but it will be there imminently. In the Vancouver Church, Vancouver, BC, Canada Church congregation, we developed a pollinator garden. In the process, one of our people, Anata Watts, created a wonderful PDF that was so professionally done that that's why we're going to put it on the website for anyone to use as a template. Even if you're not going to do a pollinator garden, it goes into the various steps that are going to be needed regardless the background, using enduring principles, the stages and considerations that any similar project may want to include. So in this first slide, you can see we aren't sure how far we want to go. And thus we divided, we wanted to do a pollinator garden. And Anata then divided the land into 4 different phases, depending on how successful and happy we became. So that was how we approached things. Again, keen on doing something, just not sure how far we could go. So just take the next step, as we have suggested, and that's what this was about. All right, we'll start with phase 1 and see where it goes from there. So next slide then. we decided we did want to go with it. The template that will be up on the web actually includes the resolution we used at the congregational level, as well as the actual budget. Now that's in Canadian dollars, so if you're in the US, sort of drop it down 20% or something. But again, we just wanted to give you, make it as easy as possible. Just change the wording of the resolution, change the numbers on the budget, and away you go. Next slide. And so the initial work was done this year, as you can see. Intergenerational, yeah, it's a great thing. And we look forward to watching the plants grow and attract various bees and insects. And we'll see what happens next year. We'll likely create a sign saying, you know, pollinator garden, so that the neighbors can see it, and it might entice inquiries from the neighborhood about how they, in their own private gardens, could start one. So that's just a quick snapshot of, and again, it is an actual project. If you want to do a pollinator garden, there you've got everything you need right in front of you. But it's more meant as a template for anything like this, because Anata very professionally put together. It's about a 10-page PDF that you can run through that will, you know, be one step easier for you to take that next step, because that wording and the process and all those various things you have to consider are already there. So I'll just keep it short like that. Be on the lookout. It'll be up on the website probably tonight, I hope. And that's it.
Okay.
Now, we'll move from that back to Joan. And Joan, you'll have to give me just a moment to,
Sure.
again, adjust my, you would think with 3 screens, I would always be right where I want to be, but such is never the case. Here we go.
We understand, Rod.
Yeah. I hope that comes up correctly.
So I mentioned a few minutes ago that we had broken down about 6 overall topics that we saw from the clips and from the whole interviews. And we want to give you the opportunity today to choose one of these areas to go into for a discussion period. In about 5 minutes, we'll be going into breakout rooms, but you're not going to be randomly assigned to a random group. You're going to be able to choose which topic you would like to learn more about, or share your experience with, or ask questions about. The first one, we talked a little bit in the webinar about, you know, how different approaches to getting the congregation involved and doing an education phase. And I will be in that room, as will Sarah Allen from the Capital Area Congregation in Lansing, Michigan. Carbon footprint reduction, getting down the CO2, things like audits and looking at infrastructure changes on our buildings, things like that. I think Rod will be taking that one. Landscaping and biodiversity, some of the projects, some of the options. Lori will be taking that. Whole food plant-based lifestyle. Janet and Jim Poirier will be available for that discussion group if you'd like to learn more about that lifestyle and why they're so passionate about it and why they believe it's good for the climate. Consumption and waste reduction. That will be Susan Oxley will be leading that discussion. Partnerships and advocacy, Dean White will be leading that. Now, before we get into these, I do want to say that in some of them, especially the more scientific and technical ones, it can be confusing because you'll hear different statistics mentioned and different surveys quoted. And I think that we need to set the stage for that a little bit. There are thousands of studies done every year. The numbers change as the techniques, the scientific techniques, become more refined, and the numbers can change based on assumptions. So for instance, what percent of the global greenhouse gas emissions is based on transportation? Can vary depending on the study, and it varies dramatically when you look at one country versus another. Heating of buildings is a big deal in Canada. It's not a big deal in the Caribbean. So I guess what we want to say here is don't get hung up on the, exact numbers. What we want to get across is to understand that, for instance, our agriculture and food industry is definitely a producer of carbon and greenhouse gases. There'll be different studies saying different things, and that's okay. We can all understand that we're looking at principles here and ideas and wrapping our heads around complex issues. So for some of these, number 2 and number 4 and number 5 in particular, please don't get hung up over exact numbers. And understand that, for instance, in agriculture, the impact of for instance, cattle raised on factory farms and feedlots that have been created in the Amazon, what used to be the Amazon forest, is far different from, or maybe far different from the farm, a few miles away from where you live that's using regenerative agricultural techniques. So next slide, please. So I hope you're thinking about what one you would like to be involved in. And these are the questions we'd like you to be thinking about for your discussion. What did you hear in the clips that you saw? What questions do you have about what you heard? What excited you? What intrigued you? What's stimulating some thoughts? What is your congregation already doing? What are some other possibilities you've thought of that you'd like to explore a little? And what do you want to know more about? So I think we're ready to go into our groups now. Lori, I think you're on.
Yeah, we have 13 minutes left, so we've got about 10 minutes. So what we're going to do, Rod's bringing the slide back up, is we want to hear a little bit about, just briefly, ideas that are intriguing you that you want to know more about, and or have you comment on how the ideas you're hearing fit into this sense of this larger sense that we all have of mission. And so the way we're going to do this, with or without the slide, is we had 6 groups. So we're going to just let people respond to those 2 questions. so you're gonna get a minute, and at the end of a minute, Joan will ring a chime. So we just want to make sure we get room to go through at least one person from each of these 6 groups, and I'm hoping for 2 rounds. So just, is there anybody that was in group 1? And now I'm gonna scoot this over so I can see the whole group. Anybody in group 1 who would like to say something that is intriguing or inviting you, that you want to know more about, and also whether or how you have a sense that taking action on climate change in your community ties in with our sense of who we are as a people and what we're called to do. Do I see a hand? Don't be
All right.
intimidated by the 1 minute mark.
There's Grandma too.
Okay, just a minute.
What's our big surprise?
All right. How about some, if I don't see somebody, we'll come back around. Somebody from the carbon footprint reduction group want to have a say.
Rod, you could go down the list you presented, or I sort of copied it down. I could quickly reiterate the major points there.
Go for it.
Okay. So there was sort of a list of points that we didn't get nearly as far as we wanted to, because there were so many things worthy of discussion. But there was a list, I guess, that was partly based on the presentation from last week that had been put together. So about a half a dozen things to think about for carbon footprint reduction at the congregational level, and those included. And this is just going to be a quick synopsis here. Carbon calculators and carbon calculators and audits. If your congregation wants to get serious, bringing in a professional to do that. Converting your lighting to LEDs, when there's a good opportunity to do that, depending on, and all this is sort of contingent on the congregation's budget and where they are and on their plans. Looking at your insulation, doors and windows, heat loss and those sorts of things you can do to upgrade those. Heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, HVAC. That's a big one, and of course it's also a major expense commitment for congregations. But looking into ways of making that more energy efficient and a lower carbon. That's the sort of thing that of course requires a lot of planning. The solar panels, that's a pretty obvious change, but it's, again, that's an expense. Different places have different levels of support, whether what the best option is for pursuing those. And again, those integrated with your with your roofing. And then supplier, basically where you're getting your energy from, and what type of energy you're doing, if you've got choices. And I'll throw in there in California, we do have increasingly choices on our electricity suppliers, our energy suppliers. So those are things to take into consideration. Anyway, that's sort of the quick list.
Thank you, Mark. Anybody from the landscaping group want to share? I already want to make note that in the chat, Mike Barnett put in 2 great book recommendations about why what we're doing with our yards and our properties is critical. So if you go back up, I want to take note of that. But anybody from that group want to say something else? Something that's catching your thought?
I like the wildlife pathways. That's really intriguing to me. And I think that's something I'm going to incorporate in. You see, my home is the church in Mossy Rocks, so I think this is something that we can probably do together, and that will be fun too.
Yeah, do it together. That's part of that mission piece, right?
Mhm.
Thank you. All right, somebody from the Whole Food Plant-Based Lifestyle Group. Number 4.
Sure. Yeah.
I'll just, it's Jim. I'll just outline a couple, because we hadn't given a presentation as such, so we more or less had to do a lot of the talking before the questions started. But we basically, in summary, a whole food plant-based lifestyle can knock 85% off your carbon footprint, flat out. And a whole food plant-based lifestyle, you do it for your health, for the earth and the resources, for the animals, and for the climate. Quite a few enduring principles in there as well. So I'll open it up to the others who have anything else that they want to share.
Yeah, and as we get, what we're going to do is we're trying to get a spokesperson for each group, and then if we have a minute or two left, we'll open it up and see what else is out there. So I want to make sure we get somebody from group 5. And thank you, Jim.
I don't know where it is.
The Susan's group, the consumption and waste reduction.
I guess I can be real quick. We talked about beeswax wraps instead of using plastic. Everyone shared what their congregations are doing, like replacing LED lights, using non-disposable dishware. We talked about, nobody knew that for the big garbage pails, instead of using plastic bags, if there's another option. And my husband just shared that when we're doing our election of officers, maybe one officer could be a carbon reduction or carbon footprint educator. It can be a youth, it could be a group of youth, it could be adults, but where they would report back their status, continuing on, and what suggestions.
Thank you, Susan. What a great idea to actually have elect some officers to and empower some people. Okay, group 6, Dean's group on partners and advocates.
Well, ours was a group of 3, 2 on one screen and me on another. Jackie and Paul Bethel joined the group with me from Southern California. And so let me just defer, first of all, Paul and Jackie, anything that struck you in our conversation that you'd like to share?
Well, we talked about a couple of sites or sources you could go to try to find groups that are local that you could tap into or participate or join. I think that the most common one is the Interfaith Power and Light. So I know there are several congregations that are involved with that. I don't know how many of our congregations are, but and then we kind of discussed some of the local groups that were involved. We live in Lincoln Beach, so we have the honor of being probably the only oil spill in this group. We talked. The Mission Center did contribute to a couple of different organizations that were working to clean that up.
Okay, thank you.
Oh,
thank you. So we're gonna turn this over for a closing meditation here in about another minute or so. Is there anyone else who just wants to say something again to this piece about how doing climate change really affects and empowers other ways of doing mission? Just anybody else with a burning sense of wanting to take just another minute or so on any of our topics?
Really quickly, Lori, my granddaughter who's in high school, we're doing a nature watch from one of the companies that you had on your website to connect with, an Ice Watch and a Frog Watch. So trying to invite youth to also be part of a solution.
Thank you. Yeah, our youth. If there's no other good motivation about why it matters, we all love our youth. So, so Joan, how much time do you need? Do we have time for another comment, or are we ready to go?
No, you can go for one more, and I see that Mark Sheldon has his
Okay,
hand raised.
that's why I was wanting to ask you.
Okay. Well, without getting into all the details, you know, one of the things that was mentioned earlier in the discussion was the difficulty of dealing with skeptics, especially from the Christian community and other faiths. I think, you know, that there's an awful lot of points that can be made about what, but I think it can always come back, especially when you're discussing with other Christians and in general people who are thoughtful, that it kind of gets back to I can't remember the verse, but early in Genesis about mankind becoming stewards of the earth. And I think that you know, whatever you think is cause and effect in terms of the environment, that behaving responsibly as in our relationship with the earth is fundamental. And so that's sort of a basis to start discussions, I think.
Our faith is in itself part of why it matters. So okay, I know Susan, oh, we didn't do group one, so I'm gonna, if you pardon me, so Susan said she had a quick comment from group one because we did skip over you quickly, so to be fair, and then on to Joan in closing for the afternoon.
Yes. Can you see me?
We saw you and then you went away.
How about
There you
now?
are. Now we can see you.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I just wanted to say quickly that Tom and I have a congregational business meeting, and we're actually some of the newer members to the Samish congregation, which unfortunately is very close to where the flooding was in Bellingham, Washington. So having a congregational audit and talking about, even though we have a fantastic community garden at the campgrounds next door, there's other ways that we could do away with the lawn, and a congregational audit is really needed for this congregation at this time. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody, remembering too that all of these topics are possibilities for future webinars. Please put any other things in the chat. We save those. We do review them to try to get comments, and let us go forth with a blessing from Joan.
Thanks, Lori. While the slide's coming up, let me just say real quick that everything we do in this respect ties into mission, because it gets us out into our neighborhoods. It gets us out into interfaith partnerships, and it all ties into mission. So we wanted to leave you with some words from Doctrine and Covenants, sections 161 and 163, to wash over us as we go in peace to be bringers of peace. And be courageous and visionary, believing in the power of just a few vibrant witnesses to transform the world. Be assured that love will overcome the voice of fear, division, and deceit. Understand that the road to transformation travels both inward and outward. The road to transformation is the path of the disciple. God is calling for a prophetic community to arise that is characterized by uncommon devotion to the compassion and peace of God revealed in Jesus Christ. Blessings to everyone. Don't forget, hopefully we'll have a vigil that you'll be hearing more about New Year's Eve, and we look forward to seeing you all in January. Please go ahead and continue to send in any questions or suggestions. Thank you for your participation.